Mesdames et Messieurs les ministres, dear ministers, members of parliament, Monsieur le Président, dear Rob, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, thank you very much for this opportunity, and I have to say that I do admire Nexus Institute, what you do and how much you delivered such strong messages, not just for Europe, but for humanity and our common values. Hello.
I think we lost something. Where is French democracy?
Where did we lost it?
Where did we lost it?
I can answer this question if you give me some time.
French demonstrants of the social and the environmental movement.
Or maybe when you bypass again French Parliament.
Nobody listens. You have millions of people in the streets. Conventions of climate has been put aside. What can you say when you talk about Europe?
Do you allow me to answer?
Authority for the President of the Republic of France, Mr. Emmanuel Macron. We are here to show light on this light.
That you want me? So, there are places where you can have violence. This is exactly places where these type of expressions are forbidden. And this is why I do believe it's very important to have social debate. I don't know, and I can answer all the questions you have on what we are discussing in France, the law we are passing, and how this is a democracy. And a democracy is exactly a place where you can demonstrate, you can have, as in your country, this type of interventions. But as in the world, we are places where democracy doesn't exist. We should not compare precisely the two situations. We can disagree, but what should accompany democracy? Because you vote and you elect people. And people elected vote for laws and they have to respect constitutions. And these constitutions were voted by people. But the counterpart is that you need respect, and this is the end of violence. The day you consider that when I disagree with the law which is passed, or the people who are elected, I can do whatever I want because I am the one to decide for the legitimacy of what I do, you put democracy at risk. From Capitol Hill to Brasilia to other types of happening, I would say. This is the main difference I do between a dictator, an autocracy, and a democracy. This is just a remark I wanted to make. And obviously I can revert in the questions on everything was mentioned, from climate to the pension reform in France and so on. But I wanted to take, indeed, the opportunity of the speech and what you offered to me, and to discuss about our Europe, and much more to discuss about our European sovereignty. And I think this concept is extremely important, especially in this time, because a little bit more than 1 year ago, Russia unleashed a war against Ukraine and opened probably one of the most perilous times of our European Union. Our Union is said to grow stronger through crisis, but never had we faced such a threat. A war involving nuclear power at our borders, and an unthinkable event that jeopardized lasting peace and brought violent conflict back to the European continent. Since our European summit in Versailles, a few weeks after the beginning of the war, during the French presidency, it was in March last year, Europe stepped forward and responded swiftly and efficiently, and has continued to do since. And both pandemic and war were a big accelerator of this European sovereignty. And this is what I wanted to advocate, and I wanted perhaps to elaborate a little bit on this concept and what it means today and what it should mean in the very context we know. European sovereignty could seem as a strange word. For years, this concept may have sounded like a French fantasy, or perhaps like European wishful thinking. I have to say, when I delivered a speech in La Sorbonne, September 17, a lot of comments were about, okay, European sovereignty, this is a French idea, this is just a speech. It will never happen. But I've decided to make these words central to my political projects, and I've never forgotten that the very concept of sovereignty has as well its roots in the Netherlands. And this is a very European concept. 350 years ago, right here in the city of The Hague, one of the founders of political modernity, Baruch Spinoza, wrote in an article 17, chapter 2 of his Tractatus Politicus, I quote him, "The right is defined by the power of the multitude. We call it sovereignty." I will not lecture you on Spinoza, I want to reassure you. I just want to highlight that in Spinoza's philosophy, sovereignty is a means to guarantee the essence of being, to persevere in oneself. To put it plainly, whoever wants to be themselves must be sovereign. In other words, and I want to insist on that, identity and sovereignty are intertwined. And I think this is very important to understand this link and the fact that Spinoza makes it as one of the founding concepts of precisely political philosophy. Because if you accept to lose your sovereignty, it means if you accept to depend on other powers, you put yourself in a situation not to decide for yourself and not to be in charge of precisely continuing, preserving, developing your own identity. See, defending sovereignty doesn't mean to shy away from our allies. It means that we must be able to choose our partners and shape our own destiny, rather than being, I would say, a mere witness of the dramatic evolution of this world. This means that we must strive to be rule makers rather than rule takers. And this we can do in a cooperative manner, in keeping with our spirit of openness and partnership. But I think the wake-up call was made during the pandemic. We discovered that we were dependent on a lot of devices, on a lot of drugs, on a lot of products, suddenly. And even those who were supposed to cooperate with us, some allies, decided to ban the export during months, as long as they were not served and protected. And during the war, those who decided to cooperate, to make trade with neighbors, even if they were not allies, Russia, for energy. Because we decided, de facto, that trade could be the best way to cooperate, could create irreversible links and precisely avoid the others to be aggressive. They decided to weaponize the energy, putting us in a completely crazy and unbelievable situation. Pandemic and war just pushed us in a situation to discover that we have to reduce our dependencies if you want to preserve the European identity. Otherwise, we will progressively be dependent on everything. And it's probably due to the fact, this is a sort of convergence with what I heard, Europe was, and especially the European Union, was too much driven by a customer approach and not sufficiently by the citizen and the producer approach. And we didn't build sufficiently how to ensure our, I would say, economic security. And my intention, what I want to advocate, is not to in a certain way, reverts to protectionism and so on. It doesn't make sense. But to try to design with you and to define in a few minutes what could be this comprehensive economic security doctrine for the European Union to guide our European action globally. And I mean to protect ourselves, our identity, and to put ourselves in a situation to define our current and our future model for ourselves. And for me, this new doctrine should be based on 5 pillars. The first one is very well known, but I want to insist on that. This is, I would say, the native one of our European Union. This is competitiveness and a stronger and a better European integration. This is the first pillar, and this is very important because you cannot be a strong role model, you cannot promote your identity, you cannot defend on the long run the European model if you are not competitive and you don't put yourself in a situation to be the one to produce the best-in-class solutions. This is why competitiveness is requested, and this is why you have to pass reforms, referring to what happened at the beginning of our discussions. Indeed, for instance, just an anecdote to illustrate. You cannot live in a continent if you decide not to be competitive at a country basis and you just leave competitiveness to the others. You kill your economy, but you put the whole continent in a situation not to be competitive and in a certain way not to produce any more in your place. How to produce aircrafts, cars, but even software or anything else if you are not competitive? The customer you are will refuse to buy at such a high price. Purchasing power is a debate everywhere. You want to buy it at a fair price. If you want to buy it at a fair price and produce it in Europe, you have to be competitive to do so. i.e., passing the reforms, being sure that you innovate, you have good labor laws, protecting your people and their rights, but creating sufficient flexibility to be competitive in an open world. This balance has to be found. France was no more balanced. I have to be very honest, 5 years ago, 6 years ago. We decreased by more than 2 points our unemployment rates thanks to the reform we passed. And we are passing a reform for pension. I'm not sure everybody is completely aware of that, but because today, this reform is quite complex, but we have special regimes for some categories which is not justified, so we have to stop with that. Because we are indebted and we have current deficits largely beyond your current deficit in Netherlands, and I'm not sure that the taxpayer in Netherlands will accept that we will finance a long-run social model in France with European taxpayer money. So I have to do the job at home. And I will pass from 62 to 64. When I compare, they should be less angry with me. Because in your country it's much higher, and in a lot of countries in Europe it's much higher than 64 years old. So matter of fact, but competitiveness and reforms being with this notion are absolutely essential if we want to stay as a continent of producer, and if we want to have the ability to decide for ourselves, i.e. to produce for ourselves. At the same time, we have now to insist on simplification and streamlining our regulation, which is absolutely key for this agenda. And we have to do much more on education, higher education and training. Because what is key for production is a very innovative word, is to have talents, skills, and to be sure that you train your people, being your native citizens or people coming from migration, to have the right skills for this current environment. And this policy is absolutely critical if you want to be sovereign and if you want to have this comprehensive economic security doctrine. But at the same time of this reform and competitiveness agenda, you need more Europe and more integration. We have to go further and much further. We have to integrate our markets. Why? Because this is the best way to have strong players. When you create a startup in one of our countries, we have to deal with 27 regulations in a lot of sectors. when you do it in China or in the US, because this is where the competition is at stake. Your domestic market is much bigger. The strength of Europe is our single market, and it's how to better integrate the single market on digital, on industry, and so on. And how, as well, to make it in common through discussions, sometimes controversies, and this unique myotic of our regulation in Europe, but building a common approach. It's even more essential on the financing of our economy, and I want to insist on that. The financing of our economy is and will be more and more critical in an innovative world, because you need talents and capital. And today we are not properly equipped. We have a very good European regulation. We did a lot post-financial crisis, but we are still very fragmented, and we don't have a proper capital market union. And we need it. Why? Because you have a lot of savings in a lot of rich countries, but these savings are not properly allocated. They have to go to very innovative SMEs and to poor or middle-income countries in our Europe. If you want the savings to be allocated on the right risk and the right places where you have opportunities and returns, you need a capital market unions to be integrated. This is not the case today. Our savings are in very rich places, but they don't circulate and they are not properly allocated, which is, for our competitiveness and our futures, I think, a weakness. So here's the first pillar of our economic doctrine: competitiveness and better European integration. This is a necessity in this economy and this environment where we are at stake. The second pillar is having industrial policies. For a very long time it was a taboo in Europe, because the first pillar was sufficient. During decades, the first pillar I mentioned was the alpha and omega of our economic policies. Having industrial policy was forbidden because it was an intervention on the market to decide something, to interfere, to create bias and so on. But we need it. Why? Because our competitors today are interfering in the market, matter of fact. And because we have to accelerate, and because we put ourselves in a situation to be too much dependent because of the unbalance between market and public intervention in Europe. Let me express by taking one example. If you don't have industrial policy, you cannot create progressively your autonomy, or at least your de-risking on energy. This is impossible. If you don't have a political an interference, I would say, or an intervention of industrial policy, you cannot create your own net zero industry. You cannot create or strengthen your own chips industry, because the other powers are interfering on that, and they have an industrial policy. And you cannot be the only lasting piece of this world with a market without industrial policy. The US has one and strengthens it. China has one. We need a European one. It doesn't mean to become autarkic in this world, but it's how to have more autonomy, or to better diversify your dependencies, to be sure that you are not trapped in a crazy situation the day something wrong will happen. So having industrial policies is and will be critical in several fields. And I want to just insist on this one. One, energy. During the past year, we made a wonderful collective job. We diversified our gas furniture. We were over-dependent on Russia. We diversified through our market interventions, finding new producers from gas. But what we will have to do is to build a new strategy where we will have progressively to reduce our dependencies and build more sovereignty on energy. which means that you can reconcile climate, and I totally agree, sovereignty and industry, by creating your own energy through basically less consumption and more energy efficiency and innovation, European innovation, by more renewables on the European soil and more nuclear energy on the European soil. This is clearly an industrial policy we are putting in place and we have to put in place. Because you have to put subsidies at the federal and national level to increase and accelerate these policies, and you have to find the right incentives to do so. Otherwise, everybody will be driven by short-term incentives and not take into consideration something else than price. You want them to take into consideration your independence, sovereignty, and climate change. This is an industrial policy where you have to gather industry, climate, and sovereignty. Second, all the energies, the technologies, and so on, you need in order to deal with climate change. We will fix climate change with a lot of regulations, and I know that your country knows very well what can happen when you put people and you progressively ask them to make a change through regulation when you have to do so. This is our agenda. This is what we decided for ourselves at the European scale. But we can do it as well if we produce the solutions on our soil. And this is critical if we want to reconcile climate change, industry, and creating economic value on our soil, and financing our social model, because there is no justice if there is no more production. If you don't produce money, you have no debate on how to share this money. And this is a big risk. If we rush for climate change, if we promote solutions we will buy, and if we don't produce these solutions. And this is exactly what's at stake today in the current environment. This is why we need industrial policy in Europe for net zero industry. And this is exactly the document issued by the European Commission a few days ago to promote this Net Zero Industrial Act, which is very important. This is how to accept some subsidies, some stated a current regulatory framework, but to be sure that we will produce and attract a maximum of innovations and new industries helping us to deal with carbon neutrality. This is critical. Otherwise, we will lose our sovereignty and our ability to decide. We will fit with the requirements. We will be carbon neutral for 2050. But with Chinese or American technologies, which will put us at risk and create a huge turmoil, because it will kill jobs and it will create a situation where we will not be in a situation to decide for ourselves. It's obviously the same on defense, where we need a common industry and we have to streamline our organization, and we need this approach. And from the CHIPS Act, boosting R&D and producing much more on this critical field, to the Net Zero Industry Act and so on, this second pillar of precisely an industrial policy in our Europe is absolutely key. As I don't want to be too long, I would say that it's exactly the same. We have to bear in mind for all the pillars where we don't want to be too much dependent. We want to be open, we want allies, we want good friends, we want partners, but we always want to be in a situation to choose them, not to be 100% dependent on them. And this is exactly the same on agriculture. We have to make a lot of changes to make our agriculture and food model compatible with climate change. But if the result of our policy is to import more and more products coming from countries less restrictive than we are or less demanding than we are, this is a failure at the end. So we do need an industrial policy for our agriculture, precisely to produce here with our rules, but to help our producers to do more. And this is why we did advocate at the European scale a protein plan to be less dependent on protein and to produce more on our continent. The third pillar of this strategy, according to me, is protection. protection of our interests. This is, I would say, the defensive side of this offensive strategy I mentioned with industrial policy. Indeed, we have to accept to protect vital interests and strategic assets when we consider they could be put at risk, when you have hostile action or distortive actions or practices. And I think this is very important. Based on security and public order criteria, the EU has, for the first time, equipped itself with a tool allowing to block or ban holdings or foreign acquisitions in strategic companies. What we decided through this regulation is a complete ideological change. Till very recently, we just considered we were open without any conditions. We recognize, for good reasons, that we need a screening of these foreign investments on some critical assets. We did exactly the opposite, by the way. During and after the financial crisis, when we pushed some member states to fire sales, selling critical assets, for instance, to Chinese interests. I mean, energy companies, ports, and so on. We decided to do now something very different. So on cyber infrastructure, critical infrastructure, cyber security, everywhere we consider we have vulnerabilities or national and European security at risk, we are entitled to have this protection mechanism to be activated and precisely to have this preventive side. This is the same on a lot of other issues, from defense to technologies and so on, and I think it's very important. And according to me, this is exactly how and why we have to follow up on the digital side regarding content. Speaking about education and culture. We were driven by free speech. I do defend and I do advocate this notion, and I'm a big defender of this free speech approach and freedom of content, because it's part of the European model. But let's be clear, when you're open without any regulation to protect yourself in this content, you expose yourselves to propaganda coming from outside. You expose yourself to algorithms decided elsewhere. And you put your children, your people, sometimes your democracy at risk. Because it can be manipulated by other interests and by people deciding for yourselves. And this is why we have now a new continent on this protective side, which is how we want to protect the content of our social medias, our artificial intelligence, on all these innovations where, we are exposed to, and which can interfere in the education of our children or the functioning of our democracy. We have to be very smart, sophisticated, coordinated, and we need a common approach. We started to do so with the famous directive DSA. We started to regulate the content. But we will have to go further, we know that, just to protect our model and our European model, and not to be in the hands of non-European private interests or non-European government interests. And I think this prevention pillar and this protection pillar is very important. The fourth pillar of our doctrine, according to me, would be reciprocity. And it would constitute, in the context of a more transactional and mutually beneficial approach, a very important circle of action of the EU. I know that the reciprocity dimension, which is certainly the most demanding at EU level, is sometimes difficult to admit. But I also observe that mindsets have gradually evolved in this area as well. It took almost 10 years for the EU to adopt the international procurement instrument, just to ensure reciprocity in public procurement. Why? Because the European approach is always a sort of complex intrication of addition of national interests. And sometimes the offensive points of some countries doesn't meet with the defensive points of the other countries. And the result is that we wanted the market to do the job. We need reciprocity. And I want to insist on the fact that reciprocity will be core, especially for the new generation of trade agreement. We will have all this debate, we know that, on Mercosur and some other trade agreements. This is very well known, and it will be everywhere, in your press, in my press, in our parliaments. I do believe in openness. I think that trade was very beneficial for the Europeans and very beneficial for most of the places of this world. And one of the best ways to fight against poverty. But you need a fair trade, and reciprocity is part of it. And the free trade agreement must now to obey a rationale which goes beyond a purely economic logic. And I want to insist on at least 3 points. First, sustainability. It's simply impossible to conceive that our EU trade policy might not be fully sustainable. We should stop signing and accepting trade agreements with governments and people which don't respect Paris Agreement and our biodiversity commitments. Otherwise, we put ourselves to over-constraint, or at least constrain our producers following our requirements and our commitments, but we will accept to import products coming from places less demanding and not compliant with Paris Agreement and biodiversity agreements. This is a double whammy approach, because you will help them basically not to respect what you believe in. You will kill your industry and you import on top of that. So let's stop that. And at this regard, the EU-New Zealand agreement established a sort of gold standard in this area and should definitely be present in all future trade agreements, which means that you need as an essential clause, not as, I would say, just a confetti or something nice on the cake, not a cherry on the cake. An essential clause of your trade agreement should be the respect of climate change and biodiversity commitments. Second, it's fairness and a balance in concessions to avoid any detrimental effects of the EU economy, especially regarding the most sensitive sectors. And third, to clear strategic interests of the agreement for the EU. How would the agreement provide privileged access to critical raw material, for example? How would it contribute effectively to diversifying EU supplies in key sectors and so on? But besides that, what we need definitely is a mirror mechanism and mirror measures to be sure that when you put constraints on your producers, you ask the same to the producers coming from the country you are signing with. This is the only way to make this trade agreement sustainable and acceptable for your people and your industry. My last pillar and my last point about this doctrine is regarding cooperation. We have to promote our agenda through a series of cooperation in order to strengthen and extend our multilateral rules and instruments, and precisely to do more together and push this European model internationally. First, of this cooperation, we have to be the one to revitalize and extend the multilateral framework. WTO is no more functioning. We need it. So we have to promote and re-promote this agenda with the US and some others. But an agreement was found on the fight against illegal fishing in June 2022. The new chairman of WTO is making a wonderful job. We have to help her to resume the very important agenda we had, precisely in order to fix conflicts and to have clear mechanism in case of conflicts. This is one of the best ways to be an open world more sustainable. Second, we have to ensure compliance by third countries with high standard of values. To this end, we have a very powerful tool, our single market as mentioned, but the external part of the single market. And the transformation of the EU has been very swift in this area too. It now makes use all of its policies well beyond the single channel of trade policy. We have started working in this direction. The instruments, for instance, to fight deforestation will, for instance, help tackle imported raw materials and processed products of which the production contributes directly or indirectly to deforestation. i.e., if we create a sort of condition of access to our single market sometimes, the fact that you cooperate on an agenda you find as essential, you are much more efficient. With regard to respect of fundamental rights, we know how much important this is, and this is exactly what we are promoting on due diligence, forced labor, and so on, and this is very important. I think this cooperative approach should be the one we use as well, working all together to team up all the European Union, its member states, the development agencies, European Investment Bank and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Developments, playing together and promoting precisely our agenda, our interests and our values with third countries. But this cooperation is absolutely key with third countries if we want to be more efficient. This is exactly the same approach we want to promote for our development model in the June summit we will organize, having all the Europeans working together to set up a new standard. As you can see, with these 5 pillars, competitiveness and single market, industrial policy, protection, reciprocity, and cooperation, we can set up a new economic doctrine which will allow us to reconcile creating jobs, financing our social model, dealing with climate change, and being more sovereign and deciding for ourselves. And I think this is critical. This is critical in this period of time where we have war and economy is being weaponized. And everything in our economy will be progressively part of national security. And I think this is critical if we want to preserve our open model, to remain open and based our approach on this capital market model. But if we don't want to depend on the other ones, and if we want to preserve our values and our European model, which is based on humanism and attachment to freedom and solidarity. Here at Nexus, 20 years ago, George Steiner gave an important speech about the idea of Europe. And he said, Europe is made up of cafes. This extends from Pesha's favorite cafe in Lisbon to the Odessa cafes haunted by Isaac Babel's gangsters. And I fully believe, I very often mention this moment of Steiner, and I fully believe in the spirit of cafe. As Steiner said, which thrives in our great continent, from Lisbon to Odessa, because cafes are closed where people are bombed. And cafe was a place where you can have controversies, discussions, you can share disagreements, but at the very end, you dream. Our Europe is made of dreams. But actual dreamers are very pragmatic. Otherwise, they finish with the dreams of the others. I'm a dreamer and idealistic, but I don't want my dreams to be dreamt in other people's language. I want our music to be the one to be played everywhere, dear Jordi. I want our literature to be precisely this permanent discussion between the different capitals of our continent, whose one of the characteristics is precisely to have so many languages and to be in a certain way driven by this permanent translation. I want our model of complexity, unity through respect and diversity to be the one to be preserved. This is why we have to reset this economic doctrine. This is why European sovereignty is not just a concept or a fantasy, but it's absolutely, in a dangerous world, a necessity to live, dream for ourselves as Europeans. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. The President will have around 50 minutes. Really? Okay. Merci beaucoup. To take questions. Let us first go to some people over there who were patiently sitting over there. And in the meantime, they did a lot of thinking. Aram, may I give this to you?
Hello, President Macron. My name is Aram, and I have a question for you. The rise of nationalism poses a challenge to the foundations of the European project. How do you... what is your vision regarding fostering a shared European identity that embraces our diverse cultural heritage, while also addressing the underlying concerns and grievances that drive national sentiments to prevent the resurgence of old conflicts?
Thank you very much. I will try to address both of you. Look, I think the national feeling is totally compatible with the European idea. Being a patriot is completely compatible with being a European, and I pretend to be both at the same time. Nationalism is different because you like your culture, your country and so on, but you consider that liking him make you an opponent to your neighbor and other Europeans. And this is why nationalism leads to war. And this is exactly why we decided to build this European Union and this European idea. To say we respect each other, we are different. But we do consider that the drama of our continent is civil war of the Europeans. And we want to defend our national culture, but we want to build a European one, which is the result of this permanent discussion. And we want to go beyond these differences. Today we have a resume of these national feelings. Why? Because we live in this very hectic, complex and times, and they are increasing anxiety. When you have anxiety, you have fears. And if you don't provide reasonable solutions for these fears, the normal reaction is that you decide to retrench on yourselves. This is your personal reaction. And this is the reaction of the different nations themselves. This is a world of anxiety, so I want a solution for myself. This is a sort of distrust of the others. I want to advocate exactly the opposite. I think on all the key challenges we have, climate change, digital change, war, and all this issue, we are much stronger together. Europe is an asset. The problem is that Europe sometimes is leading some key changes and seen as a sort of constraining power. This is quite unfair because this is always a result of the discussions and the decisions of 27 member states. But very often national leaders or local leaders have this, I would say, behavior to say, I'm sorry, I would have done differently, but this is Europe to decide. We are the Europe, the 27 capitals. Because if you want to block something, you can block something at 27, in fact. And it happened during the past few years. So this is our responsibility, and we should not make the European burden bigger. Sometimes, as Europeans, we can make mistakes. And when we picture ourselves, Europe, as a sort of process of harmonization and uniformization, it increases this feeling of anxiety because people have the feeling to lose their identity. So we have to be very careful with that. So my answer is, being a patriot and a European is compatible. In these times, we have to convince, in order to fight against the nationalistic and extremist movement, that Europe is an asset and one of the best ways to deal with your fears. Third, we have to be careful as Europeans not to be too much on the lecturing side and uniformity side. Being European is being so many nationalities and histories together. So this is unity with diversity.
Thank you. Aida, where are you? Here you are. Aida.
Hello, my name is Aida. I stutter, please know that. Before I ask my questions, thank you firstly to helping my community, the Yazidis. It's very important to state that. And my questions are related to each other. Do you think there is a neurological explanation why do we see what we see in the world? Why people calling themselves leaders in whatever title they have harm their people and just wake up and like it's nothing? What do you think a new age leadership needs? And how can you help to pioneer in the pioneer role when it comes a new leadership, and because we need societies that are rooted in health, the well-being, and you mentioned the sustainability. We need that, and let's not make the historical a fault to think that humanity is about technology only. It's about humans.
Look, as for your first question, thank you so much. I'm not sure I have a proper answer. I'm not the best expert of this type of leaders, even if I try to convince some with very poor delivery years ago. But it's clear that we have in this world some leaders sometimes taking irreversible decisions. I'm not sure that the explanation is a neurological one. This is a systematic one, and a systemic one. When you are in super-centric and non-democratic systems, you have less regulation. And you can put one or very few people to decide crazy things without regulation and counterpowers. So this is why our democracies, with the regular elections and alternates, counterpowers and so on, I think are better equipped in this complex environment, not to put our world in a crazy situation and to wake up the day after. Because when you are in such a system, you have no more, I would say, feeling to be guilty or something like that. You are in a different position. So this is my number one explanation. Second, in terms of leadership and the one we need, I will take your final remark. I totally agree with you. What I try to advocate for our doctrine and our economic doctrine is to be sure that we put this doctrine at the service of the European model. The European model is based on humanism, which, by the way, is one of the links between our two countries. From Erasmus, Montaigne, and the Enlightenment, Europe was made by these people, these thinkers, these artists, thinking that nothing was beyond human dignity. And the difference with some of the places of this world is that, and especially authoritarian regime, is that nothing is beyond either the group, the collective, the nation, or the power itself. This is not our approach. And if you put human dignity at the top, you have to create the leadership and I would say, the common organization which will allow you to do so. I.e., the political systems with check and balances in order to do so and preserve this human dignity. But second, you have to put yourself in a situation, and it was my speech, but not to depend on the others whose choices are totally different. So human dignity at the top, but being strong at the service of this philosophy. Otherwise, you can put human dignity and your values at the top. If de facto, when we go to technology, on the other skill, or defense and so on, you depend on those you disagree with or you don't like values, you will have no more choices. This is why sovereignty is so important.
Where is Lette? I got a question of Lette. No, she's there? Okay. Can you give her the microphone?
Thank you for your speech. I just graduated from my study economics, and I also heard a lot of that back in your speech. And you know, it's a rational way of thinking. But I graduated in behavioral economics, and I know that people and countries do not always behave very rational. And I was wondering, for that reason, the economy itself is not always a sufficient glue, you know, to keep the to keep Europe together. You know, then we would not have had a Brexit, for example. But if it's not the money and economies, what does work as a good glue for Europe and can keep the European countries together?
I totally agree with you. First, I think it's history and culture. And when you look at our own history and how the European Union was made and why we decided to do so, it's after the Second World War, big drama. I mean, we almost killed ourselves because of during the Second World War. And I think this generation, the generation of our founding fathers, had, I take your own formula, but this glue, it was never ever. I don't want to see that again. And they were sure that we had something to do together because our humanism, our very special relationship with freedom, and at the same time our social model, which is quite unique balance, was something they wanted to preserve. And they decided to put together steel and coal, what we needed to fight against each other during the past decade. So they said, in order to be sure, let's merge on that. And economy and industry was not the purpose and the actual glue. It was just a tool because we wanted to be sure of that. So I would say the first answer is about history, culture, feelings, emotions. The second is about, precisely politics. Controversies, permanent discussions, because we have this culture and this common history. And this is for me, by nature, I consider it as more important than economy. But I think we are entering in these times where geopolitics precisely will probably frame and decide on geoeconomics. This is a very new moment. And beyond that, and this is what makes us common, our values. We are a continent of common values. And even before our European Union, we have the Council of Europe and a common charter, and we decided to put in a common constitution these values. And we fight for that. We fought for that and we still fight for that. This is a much more efficient way to remain together. Economy, for me, is at the service of this project, as long as it provides opportunities and progress for your middle classes. But this is another debate.
Jonas van Dalen, waar is Jonas? Daar is Jonas. Wacht even voor de microfoon komt eraan.
Hi. I am studying to be a writer at the University of the Arts, Utrecht, and I was wondering, which literary character do you most identify with? Since you are an avid reader and even a writer yourself, or what type of character do you most identify with? More of an anti-hero or a hero? An antagonist, maybe?
Thank you so much. Because it's always a source of a lot of comments. And no, as a reader, I think I love Stendhal's character. But I'm not so sure I would identify myself to them. But you never have a clear view of yourself, and sometimes you view yourself as you dream of. But I'm much more inspired from the political point of view by probably Alexandre Dumas' characters than Stendhal's ones. But as a reader, my favorite one was this one. As an anti-hero, I would say Flaubert is much more inspiring. Frédéric in L'éducation sentimentale is probably one of the most inspiring one, because even at the end he sees the revolution happening and realizes he will not be part of it. And this is a big risk for the anti-hero, I would say. But here is about, I would say it will be my first answer. I can think about your question longer to find in other literature type of heroes and anti-heroes. I will see. But this is a good occasion, and I like the way you had in your question to merge hero and anti-hero. And myself, I just mentioned some novels and French novels, but our continent, and it's part of the glue you mentioned, what makes us common? This is precisely the ability of our literature to invent this unique way to tell stories with irony and with this approach where you can have hero and huge tales, almost a sort of, myth, and we had myth in the antique times. But the invention of the novel, and Cervantes, seen as a founding father of this category, is exactly that, with irony and some distance with yourself. You have hero and you have anti-hero. Don Quixote is probably an anti-hero. He is a hero as well. He's both at the same time. And this is European identity. In a lot of other continents, you have myth, you have tales and so on, but we invented here in this place and we expanded, and Latin America now is absolutely wonderful continent, just to mention one, or Africa of novelists. But this is a European invention to have this way to tell stories and build characters that you can love, cherish, admire, and mock. So this is why, this is a big chance at the end of the day.
One final question, because although the president is very generous in his time, the protocol people told me that they will kill me if you're not in time for the state dinner. So,
hello, thank you. I'd like to dive a little deeper into the role of culture, and we just talked about how culture and the arts are some kind of glue for Europe. I'd like to talk about the intrinsic value of art. It was even a French poet who coined the term l'art pour l'art. And nowadays I feel like the economical and political value of art is more dominant in our society. So what is your opinion on that? And is there any role of the intrinsic value of art? And what is the future of the arts for Europe?
I think this is a very complicated question to say. If there is an intrinsic value for art, and I think it could be quite a tricky question if you start saying there is an intrinsic value, somebody can judge there is an intrinsic value, and some art will not respect this intrinsic value, and some freedom is probably the main one. This is the ability of people to express something that you consider as impossible to be expressed. This is finding a language that you could not imagine. And for me, the unique thing that artists provoke is precisely that they reveal to yourself this dignity we mentioned, which is core for our Europe. The fact that you feel something which cannot be reduced to your material life. Something which makes you alive. Something which makes you dream. Something which will make you fight for it, even if you don't manage to express it properly. Because the music just creates a unique emotion. Because a poem puts the right words on something you felt and you were unable to express for yourself. And you found a poet from Lisbon or Cracovia expressing it for you. This is for me exactly what the art means. And this is why the liberty to create, this freedom of the artist, is the most essential one. But it's not a value in itself, because nobody can judge. But this is the unique expression, and this is how it reveals our dignity, our strength, our vulnerability as human beings, both the artists and the one to be moved. And I would not claim that Europe is the only one to have artists. It would be ridiculous. We have artists everywhere, and you have a lot of artists in countries where our values are not respected, and this freedom is not respected, precisely because they manage to create this very personal link and this reading of the world, this new interpretation of our world and our current times. And this is why they are so unique. And this is why there is no, for me, I already mentioned that, but this is part of this dignity and one of the most essential things of our life. Thank you for your question.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to make 4 final remarks. First of all, the list of people we have to thank is too long, but I want to make 2 exceptions. One to the sponsors who facilitated that we could have this wonderful venue, which is Foundation 1999, the Brooks Foundation, and Mark and Janneke Dreesman. I also would like to thank what we call the support team of Nexus in the Elysée. Garance Pino, Chloe Coupil, Anastasia. Without them we could not have organized this at all. So join me in a big applause to all those people. If you